are talking today about chapters 7, 8, and 9 of A Discovery of Witches. And guys, it turns out we actually have a lot to say about these chapters. As this podcast is coming out, you guys are probably in the middle of the real-time read-along. So we are going to be stepping back a little bit, a couple chapters, to when we get really a lot of background and stuff about Matthew that is super important and super helpful for as we go forward in the series. Jen, how did you react to these 3 chapters?
I would say not so much chapter 7, but chapters 8 and 9 for me are definitely the meatiest parts of the book that we've had so far. We've kind of had hints of a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in these 3 chapters, but this is the first time when they're more fleshed out. There's a lot of really good character work, and there's a lot of really good thematic things and story things happening here. So yeah, it's very exciting.
The more I read these 3 chapters, I know that in the last episode I talked about that moment where I think that Matthew takes a turn towards Diana. This is the section of the book, these 3 chapters, where I fall for Matthew. And there are a couple different dimensions to that I'd like to explore. Like, initially, I was not as enthralled with the idea of Matthew. I found him a little cold and a little hard to reach. And I think that as I was reading the book the first time, I probably didn't fall for Matthew until later. But as I'm rereading it and I know what to look for, I see a great deal of what I love about Matthew in basically different aspects of these 3 chapters. And so I'm really, really excited to talk about these because this time rereading them and trying to dissect them, they absolutely blew me away.
Yeah. And I feel like he becomes much more accessible as a character in these 3 chapters because we've had, frankly, very little of him from his perspective up until this point. So.
And there's some, I think, narrative theory behind some of that. While preparing for this podcast, I have been listening to another podcast called How Story Works that talks about narrative. And one of the things I found really helpful is the model that is used in that podcast of how to build a really relatable character with basically a triangle of strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Strengths being the things that the character is good at, weaknesses being the things that the character is not so good at, and then vulnerabilities being based in fear, shame, identity, or love that you have to see and understand in the character in order to be able to connect with them. And I think that for me, these are the 3 chapters where we get bits and bobs of all 3 of those things from Matthew. So he begins to open up. For the first time, you get to see a bit of his vulnerability in particular, which is what makes him accessible for me.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So do you want to do our summary? Our Kate summary?
Our Kate summary. I forgot that I was supposed to do a summary. Okay, I can do it. So in chapter 7, we find that Diana has gone back onto the river, and when she gets off of the river, she's finished her row, she's had a nice morning, she begins walking with her eyes closed, and as she's doing so, a shape rises out of the mist. It turns out to be Matthew Claremont. He frightens the ever-loving daylights out of her, but then they actually go on to have a relatively nice morning where he invites her out for breakfast, and either because it's cold and foggy or she's really hungry, she says, you know what, getting in a Jaguar with a vampire, I can dig.
Good idea.
And so she... yeah. Great idea. And so she gets in the Jaguar. They go to have breakfast at a little breakfast nook in Oxford, and that's where they have their first really deep conversation as equals, where they start talking about the things that matter to them and what is going on in the world of the book and what it might mean to each of them. In chapter 8, Matthew invites Diana to accompany him to yoga. He goes to get her and brings her to the Old Lodge, which we find out much, much later is Matthew's home from the 16th century. And he brings her there. The class is led by a witch. She is astounded because there are so many creatures together, and they go through this yoga class, end up having tea at the Old Lodge later on, and they end on sort of a bittersweet note where he essentially distances himself from her. And in chapter 9, we find that Matthew has essentially fled Oxford for Scotland, and the hunting lodge slash weekend folly of his best friend Hamish, who is a demon. And they, over the course of several days, a great deal of wine and whiskey and billiards and hunting, sort of get to the bottom of what is bothering Matthew about Diana and about engaging with Diana as the story moves forward. So those are our 3 chapters, and that's really giving them the shortest shrift possible because there's a lot of meat here. So I guess let's go ahead and start in chapter 7. Where would you like to begin?
Well, I think so. The chapter 7 starts out with a nightmare, right? Diana has this nightmare that she's drowning and she can't get up to the surface, and she gets pulled back down, and she wakes up, and then she wakes up and she blames Matthew for this feeling of, I guess, this unsettled feeling that she's been having. She hasn't been sleeping well. And I'm kind of curious why she does that. I guess.
Do you have any thoughts on why she does that?
I think maybe it's just her denial again. She's just like, well, Matthew is the newest addition. He's the odd thing out, I guess, in my life right now, according to her. And so he basically gets the brunt of the blame for all the things that are going wrong, quote unquote wrong, in her life right now. So, but I was kind of curious what you thought about that. Just her like snap instinct to blame him for something that's not really his fault.
To be honest, I'm not sure that I'd ever really considered it until you mentioned it. The thing that struck me about that particular section of the chapter is actually when she talks about how something had caught her, and we had that discussion in our last episode about Diana as hunted as opposed to huntress, and how that might relate to her feeling of always being watchful and trying to remain hidden. And so I hadn't really, until you mentioned it, thought about this nightmare. I do think it's very different or very interesting that she finds herself at the bottom of something and unable to get up, which will be an important feature later in this book. But I'm not really sure why she blames Matthew Clairmont other than potentially a subconscious turning towards him, a subconscious inclusion and accommodation of him in the way that she views the world. Like, for better or for worse, her view of the world has shifted to have Matthew Clairmont in it, and to have Matthew Clairmont as a defining feature in it, almost without her noticing.
Yeah, I would definitely buy that. And she has this phrase, and she says, when she wakes up, she says something about as is usual with nightmares. So that means like she has nightmares on a fairly regular basis is what I'm reading that as. So, and then she decides to shake it all off. She's going to go running and rowing, even though there is dense fog. And she decides she's going to go. And she talks about using quote unquote instincts when rowing through the fog, which I feel like at this point for Diana is just code for magic. You know, she says instincts and I'm like, sure. Magic, in other words.
An interesting piece of foreshadowing that I picked out in this part of the chapter is on page 63, where she says, "It was so quiet in the early morning mist that time and place receded. I closed my eyes, imagining that I was nowhere, not in Oxford, nor anywhere that had a name." And for me, that conjures not only her latent magic, but also the way that she will come to use it over the course of the book. And like we talked about in our first episode, that the defining feature of Oxford in so many places that Matthew and Diana go over the course of this book is that they exist in multiple spaces and places in time, with multiple people and different experiences layered on top of them, which is, that's just a nice sort of callback and bit of foreshadowing for me.
And then she proceeds to, of course, walk with her eyes closed, and then she almost literally bumps into Matthew. And he's like, why are you walking with your eyes closed? And she basically says, what? I do it all the time. Don't you do it? And he's like, no. No, I do not. What are you talking about? And so I feel like that as well is kind of like the witch's third eye, or, you know, her practicing magic without fully realizing it, which we are definitely going to talk about more in this reading here when we get to chapter 8.
Absolutely. I think that I actually have a moment in this chapter and in those lines where I feel a bit of empathy and sympathy for Diana, because I used to do a lot of stuff with my eyes closed when I was younger. In fact, when I lived in New York in my 20s, I say that like it was 1,000 years ago, but bear with me. I used to play this game with myself where whenever I was in a cab, I would actually close my eyes and lean back and see if I could tell where I was in the city just by the smell and the noise in the cab window. And so I have sort of a fondness for the fact that Diana bumbles about in the dark trying to figure out where she is, trying to just like inhabit the space and know it that way, which is silly, and I've certainly never done it next to a river.
Right, and like in the street, in the fog, and where no one can see you.
I have been known to ride horses with my eyes closed, so when we get to that part, I'll be like, oh, Diana and I, we are soul sisters. I get this.
And like, here's the thing too about it. There is something that's a little bit endearing about it because, okay, so like I was a weird kid also.
You're calling me weird now?
In the best way. Just that, like, you will do something growing up and you'll find out later that nobody else does that, and you kind of been in this existence where you just assumed everybody did that, and then you're like, oh, I guess everybody doesn't do that. So I can kind of see her perspective in that, like, it's just something that she's always done and she's being called out on it, and she's like, wait, doesn't everybody do that? And he's like, no, they don't. So yeah, I see where you could get the empathy for her for sure. So why does she ride home with Matthew? Why is this a good idea today?
I don't know what changes other than perhaps her curiosity and maybe his persistence. I don't know why she makes the decision, and I'm not sure that we have a good textual answer for it. I think there's maybe a good deal of subtext there, which is that we've danced around the idea that he's always on her mind and that she's thinking about him and that she has sort of subtly shifted her existence to reflect his presence in it. And so it seems at some point like magnetism. Like it just seems like there's a certain amount of momentum bringing them closer and closer together. And wherever that comes from, I'm not sure that it's necessarily described in the book so much as it just sort of takes place. It just moves in that direction.
Yeah, I don't think she knows why either at this point, which is why I feel like it's just kind of like, I don't know, it seemed like a good idea. Like, oh, let's go. Sure.
Which, again, points to one of the aspects of Diana's characterization, which is that sometimes she does not think things through, and sometimes she doesn't have the best judgment, which interestingly is something she shares with Matthew, although his comes out of anger typically when he makes bad choices, anger or possessiveness, and hers tends to come out of
whimsy. Like it just seems kind of like curiosity, and
when she wants to be, she can be pretty decisive with not a lot of forethought.
With poor choices.
This is also the chapter where we get this first statement about Matthew having sort of like a shy, pleased, soft side, where he's actually quite flattered that she gets in the car with him, that it's not... Okay, so maybe I'll back up a little bit and say that perhaps one of the reasons that she gets in the car with Matthew is that although we play with this dangerous vampire trope, there are so many opportunities that he could have had to hurt her, overpower her, otherwise undermine her, or purposefully frighten her, and he has not done so. There is something more or different about Matthew, or perhaps about Harkness's vampires in general, that has more to do with like their latent dangerousness. It's always there, but there are ways in which it's not celebrated that it is in other vampire type stories.
I feel like there are definitely vampire characters later in this book who might go that route, but currently, I mean, just as an outsider opinion of vampires, I think you're right that Matthew has kind of just been waiting rather than...
Right. I guess that's not to say that he's not dangerous. It's to say that his dangerousness is not the snatch you out of the shadows and whisk you away to his crypt type.
It's not predatory and... well, in so much that his intention is not to be predatory and take her somewhere that she does not want to go. His intention currently is curiosity mostly.
Fascination and in a certain level of infatuation, I think. The combination of his curiosity being piqued by her witch's shimmer, and then the fact that she has challenged him, and Hamish talks about it in chapter 9, but she is not responding to him the way that most of the women in Matthew Claremont's life appear to have done before. So I think that's certainly part of it. And she's just like, oh, well, it seems like a nice car and it's cold and I'm hungry.
I mean, it's a Jaguar. Like,
it's an old model Jaguar, too.
It's an old model Jaguar, but it's like it's new.
Of course it is, because everything about Matthew, he just preserves things for all time.
Mm-hmm. Money, money, money.
Money.
A little money hint here.
Right, absolutely.
So then they go to breakfast.
They do.
At this lovely, I would like to join them at breakfast.
Absolutely.
In this lovely cafe.
Well, before we get quite to breakfast, I would like to talk about this interaction, this beat that they have of minor conflict, where Diana gets really pissy that he goes to open the door for her, and then he sort of makes fun of her. She says, "How did you get here so fast?" I grumbled, and he says, "Magic," through pursed lips, because he's flirting with her a bit, I think, at this point. And
there's some flirtiness in these chapters for sure.
And I don't know how to resolve that beat between them, where she's insistent on, I can do this by myself, and he's like, but I'm just trying to be courteous, like, this is how I know to behave. Why won't you just let me be me? I don't know that it gets resolved, other than to say that they walk away from each other at that point.
And then when they get to the breakfast place, he opens the door for her, and she's finally like, fine. This is not an argument worth having, I guess, is what it comes down to for her.
It's the first time that they reach sort of a point of compromise or acquiescence where they agree to disagree, and she says, okay, this thing doesn't matter to me, but maybe other things would do, I think.
And I think a little bit too, like, she kind of buys his explanation that it's not because, or I think we get that perhaps in chapter 8 where he says it's not because she's not capable, it's because he wants to be courteous. And she's like, well, I'm capable of doing it. And he's like, that's not really the point. He's like, I know you are.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to resolve that, because there's a part of me that I think instinctively growing up with the version of feminism that I think I understood when I was much younger, I'm like, I can open my own door. Like, I feel for Diana in that moment.
Sure.
And yet, perhaps it's because I read my own reaction into it, which would be like, okay, fine, if it's really that important to you, and it's not because you don't think I can do it on my own, then maybe I'll just let this go.
Right. Yeah. Like, if you're not being condescended to, feel like it's something that, you're like, okay, and it's acceptable in this instance.
So that's actually a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, and why I think that I am a little bit in love with Chapter 7, even though it appears to be the least meaty of all the chapters. And it's the idea of condescension in that medieval liege lord way that once upon a time we heard talked about, I think in an Outlander seminar, about the idea of condescension being someone of a certain class taking the time to notice, cater to, and otherwise ask about the people who are differently situated from them. And so for me, this chapter, when we talk about Matthew interacting with humans, and interacting with humans who theoretically are a source of food for him.
Potentially, yeah.
Interacting with wounded humans that need his skills and his expertise. I think this is the beginning of us seeing Matthew's ethics, but it's also him showing a certain amount of care and consideration for people who are not like him and who are not born to what he is. And the fact that he goes in and he knows Mary's name, and he knows Dan, and he knows everybody in this cafe. There's something about that strikes me, perhaps because it signals, like he says later in chapter 8 about going through the motions of having tea, that he's essentially lonely too, and he wants to be around people and around noise and around the community of warm bloods going about doing their thing.
Yeah, and I love that it shows his connection with other beings, because like we've talked about before, Diana's fairly solitary. She doesn't have an inner circle really. She has Chris, she has her aunts, but she holds them all at a distance, and we're contrasting that with Matthew, who, like, these are random people in a cafe, and he obviously knows them, has a relationship with them, like, saved their life. So it's a very interesting contrast to me having the vampire be the one with this extended circle of relationships that are not just vampires.
And an extended circle of people to whom he gives a great deal of consideration and to whom he is polite. And like I said earlier, I think that this is probably the first time in the book where Matthew and Diana really face one another as equals. Like, it's a choice for both of them to be there at the table, nothing between them except for apparently a full English breakfast and a couple cups of tea. And they start having a real conversation about what it is that they're both looking for. Now, Diana has this terrible moment where she's reckless and impolite and starts talking to him about, well, what is your drink? Come on, Diana.
Like, we know you don't know a lot about creatures, but I feel like that's the one thing that we can assume you know.
It's just
about vampires.
Rude.
It's very rude. Yeah, and it's not even like flirtatious. You're just like, what? It's not like, oh, but what is your drink? It's just like, okay. And he gets angry, which I feel like is rightfully PO'd at her because she's being an idiot.
And because we're so deeply situated in Diana's POV, we get all of this stuff from her about how his mood swings are really frightening to her and unexpected. And yet, when you look at them for a minute, you're like,
he's not really swinging.
Or if he is
very
swinging,
much.
It's because you were just incredibly rude to him.
Yeah.
And so maybe, like, the speed at which he got angry at you for mocking the fact that he's probably hungry and sitting surrounded by a bunch of warm bloods while you tuck into your bacon and stewed tomatoes.
And your perfectly prepared tea.
Your perfect tea. You know, she's just like, she is like a bull in a china shop for parts of this conversation. And having listened to our first 2 episodes, I sometimes think that people might believe that we don't actually like Diana. I do. I love Diana. That doesn't mean that I don't think that she could use a little bit of self-awareness sometimes.
She needs some people skills. I feel like this is a good indication that she's isolated herself a little too much and perhaps could do with hanging out with some actual people that are alive.
As we learn later, you know, she hasn't had the strongest dating game, so maybe she's just not really good at this part.
Anyway.
And I told you, my heart goes a little bit flutter in this chapter. I actually love that Matthew starts building himself a little castle with
the tea, with the sugar and the packets
and
of
the salt and
whatever
pepper
that are
shaker.
on the table.
And I can just imagine, like, she describes him as this, like, big, imposing, elegant vampire, and he's just like
fidgeting with the table thing,
building a little moat between them and then taking it apart. He's fiddling because he can't eat, he can't
concentrate or
participate in the thing that she's doing. And I imagine that over the course of thousands of years, sitting through meals that you're probably not going to eat, you gotta find something to do.
Might as well fidget.
Might as well fidget.
Yeah, it's fairly adorable. Yeah.
With respect to that earlier thing I said on the bottom of page 70, sometimes I'm going to call out my notes just because I amuse myself. So on the bottom of page 70, she says, they used to be interested in the wise, I conceded, keeping a wary, there we go, keeping a wary eye on him. His sudden shifts in mood were downright frightening. I have an arrow to the comment, that's because you are being pedantic and slow. A little reader insertion. Diana, yes, hello? Earth to Diana.
This is because you're being stupid.
This is because you're being a little bit cheeky with a vampire.
You're being sassy and, like, bordering, like, not just sassy, mostly rude, with a slight hint of sass.
I also have another note that entertained me on page 71 where she calls him a liar. I have it circled 3 times with an arrow that says, you're one to talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although that part I feel like is less offensive because she's they are both incredibly intelligent people having a discussion about their professions and him saying, like, oh, I don't know. And she's like, whatever, like, you're lying. You totally do. You at least have an idea because we're both intelligent individuals.
Absolutely. And the other thing that really captures my fancy about this conversation is that you can see glimpses of the best and worst at both of them on display in this conversation. You have in one very quick and seemingly unimportant sketch the best and the worst of Matthew. For instance, like his consideration, his thoughtfulness, his intellect, his sensitivity, but you also have his secretiveness, his possessiveness, his temper, his tendency to be a bit imperious, as I said, his arrogance. You have all of those things in one snapshot, which is a really nice sketch of him and a thumbnail for me. And then for Diana, you also have her intelligence, her bravery, her stubbornness, her enthusiasm for the things she enjoys. I like a girl who likes to eat, after all. But then you also have her willful ignorance, her tendency to be a bit uncouth, her recklessness. All of these things are on display, I think, at the same time.
And I feel like it says something about both of them that they at the same time are being both like lovely and terrible during this conversation, but they're still existing, they're still having the conversation. Neither of them is like, oh, I'm out. You were rude. Peace. Bye.
Absolutely. And that may be one of the greater themes of this series and of their development. The idea that people are both light and dark at the same time, and you should not reject them just because there are dark parts of them. You can have a fulfilling and engaging and worthwhile, mature relationship with people who have both. And in fact, that's what worthwhile, mature, developed relationships are. They are balancing of one another's light and dark, and a willingness to say, you are being inappropriate or wretched or arrogant, and you need to fix yourself, but I know you'll do the same for me. And I can honor the things about you that are not lost, the things about you that are not dark and shadowed. I can honor the things that are really, truly, honestly good and love the whole person. And I think this is where we see the first seeds of that theme coming to the forefront, although in the course of the series, I think that they sort of step backwards and forwards in terms of who's being better, more mature, or more whole and more authentic. But that doesn't mean that they're not both trying most of the time to be a more authentic and full version of themselves.
Right. And they're both, in this conversation, not always, but most of the time, they're both capable of also being on the receiving end of the criticism. Like Diana makes that comment about his drink, and then he gets angry, and she's like, I should not have said that. And he is like, you're right, you shouldn't have. But she was like instantly apologetic and like recognizing about herself and being on the receiving end of that criticism that was like, you were rude. And she was like, yes, I was. I am sorry.
Absolutely. And symbolically, not only is this the first time that they sit down as equals, it's also the first thing that they share. And the first time that they start sharing bits of themselves that they would rather not tell. And the amount that Matthew gives her in this conversation is a tell, I think, that we don't really explore until we get to Hamish. But it's a tell for what he wants to be able to give her. The fact that he's slowly opening more and more of himself, which it becomes clear he just doesn't do. But he also recognizes when she does it, like on page 73, where she starts talking about why she studies alchemy. And she basically admits that she wants to understand magic and its place in the world, and how human beings became fearful of magic, suspicious of magic, unable to look at and confront magic. And he says, thank you. He just acknowledges the difficulty and moves on. Doesn't dwell on it, just says, that was hard for you. You did a good thing. Let's keep going.
And I think interesting too that they touch on the topic. He is talking about science and wanting to know the why, the answers to the why questions, and being a good scientist, and pointing out that the alchemists wanted to answer the same questions that Matthew wants to answer, and that they have this common ground between them, even though Diana is still very much in denial about it and not ready to recognize the thing that she's been studying for a lot of her life is actually very connected to magic and the same things that he is trying to study.
That's good.
Sometimes I say smart things.
You always say smart things. You stop it.
So do you. And the same thing, incidentally, he wants to find out the same thing that Agatha wants to know, which Agatha, if we remember the demon from last time, she wants to know where demons came from. So the demons want to know is where the demons came from. And Matthew wants to answer the same questions, but he just happens to be a vampire.
Isn't it interesting, and I think we explore this more in next week's reading, but the only group of people portrayed in this novel who don't think that the book has to do with that question are the witches.
Right. And I think we might have to wait a bit.
We will.
To fully talk about that one. But yes, the witches have a completely different idea of what the book is.
The demon and the vampire both believe that the book has something to do with the idea of origins or the idea of purpose, and how each of the species, if we use Diana as a representative of witches or what it might be like for a witch, all of them are lost in a certain way in terms of understanding how they fit together, but also how they fit amongst the worlds of humans.
Is that all we had to say about breakfast? Oh, we get the first wonderings about how old Matthew is during breakfast, which is going to come up from for a few chapters until we get the actual answer. It's going to continue to arise. How old is Matthew, actually? Diana wonders.
But that's also curious because she's been so rude about so many other things, and she somehow senses that asking a vampire how old they are is
super rude.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because they're secretive and because they live a long time and they know a lot of people. And Hamish touches on that later in this reading, where he talks about how many lives a vampire lives and how many people they essentially have to shed over the course of time, and how they might have, there's so much there that you almost couldn't interact with one if you couldn't stay in the moment, if you couldn't stay in the here and now of who they are right this second, as opposed to who they have been before.
Which I feel like is something we're definitely going to examine, not as much in this book, but when we get to book 2, that is a theme throughout book 2, is dealing with the different persons of Matthew over the course of his life.
Which has something to do with survival, individual, and I think also species survival. Oh, I was just going to say, I remember when we were first discussing this reading, you had a lot of thoughts about yoga. So I think that we should move into talking about yoga and the Old Lodge and Amira, and I'm just going to let you go.
Okie dokie, Smokey. So yeah, at the end of breakfast, he's driving her back, and she makes a casual reference to the fact that she needs to do yoga because she's sore, and he's like, what? I also do yoga. This is a thing we do like the same sports. We like yoga. And so he suggests to her that she come with him to his yoga class, but he doesn't tell her any more about it. And he's like, I'll pick you up tomorrow, whatever. And their discussion of yoga, she enjoys yoga because it's a combination of movement and meditation. And he has that lovely note where when he says, well, it's a lot like rowing for you. You row as though you were meditating, moving and meditating at the same time. So they proceed in the next chapter to actually go to yoga. There is some flirtation in the beginning of the chapter where she makes a snappy comment about his car and how it's just so obvious that he's a vampire, and he makes a clever retort, and so there's some flirting going on. So they end up at the Old Lodge, and they meet Amira, who is our yogi, and she is of Eastern descent. somewhere, India, we're not sure, and she leads the yoga class. And I have mixed feelings about Amira as a character because on the one hand, I feel she treads into the like spiritual Eastern person trope. But as we discussed in a conversation separate from this podcast, if she were not of that descent, would she then tread into the faux spiritual, like, white girl trope? So I'm not sure. And I'm curious what you think about her as a character and how she's presented.
I wish we got more of Amira, frankly, because I am... The explanation that Matthew gives for how he and Amira became friends doesn't satisfy me entirely. I think that there is more to that, and the fact that despite all of the prejudices that we have seen Matthew exhibit, talk about, embody in the time that we've spent with him, at the same time, he's a little bit of a radical and a progressive because he is close buddies with a witch and he allows a witch to live in his house and he allows her to conduct these classes that it appears are at his encouragement and maybe his instigation for all of these people to get together and to just be themselves. And so I wish we got more of Amira because I think she would be a very interesting character, but I do think that there is sort of a sense in which Amira is not as fleshed out as I would like her to be, and therefore she does tread a little bit into the, do we really have to have an Indian witch leading the class, and yet if we didn't, then that would be almost weirder. And I don't know that it's meaningful other than to say that I was sort of like, okay.
Yeah. And and I like her, and it's not a spoiler to say, like, we'll almost never see her again. Almost. We'll see a tiny bit of her moving forward. So, but yeah, I would be fascinated to know her story.
Absolutely. And that's not to say that that every character that crosses the page necessarily has to play a huge role. It's just because of who she is and what she does and how she is situated in the novel that she causes me to wish there were more of her so that she were fleshed out a bit and she's not just a blip on the radar. This is the first time that Matthew and Diana touch, and we learn that he does run a bit cold.
Yes, which she makes an interesting comment about that. She says, as ever, the contrast between our body temperatures took me aback. And I'm sitting here like, so remind me again when you guys touched before? Like actual skin on skin?
I think maybe they shook hands the first... I think they did in the first...
Okay. Because I was like, racking my brain. Like, he grabbed her arm, but she was wearing a sweater. So I'm like, I'm racking my brain for when you guys actually touched.
She also slammed into him in the Bodleian. Remember, she went flying down the stairs and she fell literally into his arms.
Okay, so this is maybe just like the first time she's actually like mentioned the difference in skin temperature.
The first time that they've voluntarily touched and it hasn't been Matthew literally running into Diana or vice versa.
Yes, and then he gives her a comforting little hand squeeze, which confuses them both as they go into yoga. But it's kind of adorable.
I think that that's a touch of human experience, right? Hasn't everybody had one of those, like, are we doing this or are we not hand squeezes? Yeah, it's endearing. It's definitely endearing. And there's at the beginning of the courtship. In this chapter, I picked up on some themes about inclusion and exclusion that I thought were super interesting.
I have a question before we venture into the mixed class, if that's okay.
Go on.
Why do you think it is that Amira slows Diana's heartbeat? Is it just to make her more comfortable, or is it because Amira's like, you're about to walk into a classroom full of vampires. I would prefer if you were a little bit less interesting for them.
I never thought about that.
I only just thought about it this time around.
You know what else that makes me think of? The fact that when the wizard that we will soon know as Peter Knox forces his way into her head and is trying to do that, or when in this chapter the other witch starts sort of nudging into her brain, that's super rude, but for some reason Amira grabbing her wrist and forcing her heart rate to slow is treated as though that's fine. And I wonder what the distinction is.
I don't. Is it because Amira is the teacher? So there's a certain amount of like trust already like implied in that relationship? Or is it like strictly functional? Like there are vampires, you have a really fast heartbeat. I would prefer like to make everybody more comfortable by just.
Is it because Matthew trusts her?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's definitely a lot of it because in this chapter, actually, while she's driving to the old lodge in his car, she shows kind of an interesting level of relative comfort in his presence, just the two of them together, even though they really have not known each other very long or spent very much time together. And she kind of just like dozes off in his car on the way there. So yeah, I would buy that because this is Matthew's class. He obviously knows Amira, that Diana's like, okay, cool. It's fine.
I don't know. Now that you've mentioned that about Amira, I do wonder if she is doing that because she feels sorry for Diana, but also because she is trying to do something very specific with this class, and Diana's anxiety is going to get in the way, and Diana's anxiety is going to impede others from being able to participate the way that they ordinarily would.
So perhaps a bit of both, but it's definitely not seen as invasive, which other magical things in this book are seen as very invasive, which I would put them in the same category, honestly. So, yeah. I don't know. I just found it interesting. Wanted to know what you thought.
Well, the answer is I hadn't thought about it very much at all, so thank you for highlighting it.
Well, you're welcome. So, you had thoughts on the mixed class.
I do have thoughts on the mixed class. I absolutely do. Matthew has this comment when they first enter the room about how in order to join this yoga class, you quote unquote have to be one of us. And that language is striking because it's an acknowledgement that they are separate from humans and that there is something about their collective experience as creatures that is unique, and for some reason they need a space in which they can exercise that away from humans. So that's the first thing. But then on page 79, we go through this bit where Diana's sort of like, this is weird for me, and the witch sort of nudges, and the demon sort of nudges, and the vampires look at her funny, but then everybody sort of settles, and Amira begins her class with this mantra about, we're here tonight to learn to manage our energy, we spend our time striving and straining to be something that we're not, let those desires go, honor who you are. And I had this light bulb as I was reading this week about how one of the things that this chapter is trying to say is that difference and the feeling of being different is actually universal. This is the first time that we get something outside, I think, of Diana's experience that talks about or contemplates in a collective way how difficult it might be for other creatures to hide themselves from human eyes, to be a part of a human world in which they display so many unique characteristics, when hiding a demon's brilliance or a vampire's speed or the fact that they don't need to sleep as much or any of those things. This idea that to feel different is universal, and that's not just something I think that applies to vampires, but also applies to readers.
Readers, yes. Average Joe humans, as we are.
Did you notice that Diana connects with her magic during this?
Yes, and I'm glad we brought that up because I would hypothesize, I would put it to the group that this is the first time that something unexpected happens with Diana's magic that she takes note of. Doesn't call it magic, but this is the first something outside of what she would normally do happens to her with that jolt from the floor. Like she's trying to connect to the room and follow the meditation, and she feels this jolt from the floor. And I'm like, having read it before, I now can look at it and be like, so that was the first kind of like whisper of something new happening with Diana.
And it happens at this moment where she and all these other creatures, going back to the idea of inclusion, exclusion, and the universality of difference and that stuff, they're all engaged in the collective work of the yoga, right? They're all moving differently but the same.
Right. And they're together. I mean, notably.
Together as one. Mm-hmm. And that's a really remarkable scene to have when you contemplate how much time is spent in the first 80 pages of this book talking about how different they are. What do you think is it about the corpse pose that unsettles Diana? What happens there?
Other than that, it's called the corpse pose.
Well, that unsettles me
I could
too.
see. Yeah, so I feel because Diana has so much kind of anxiety about things, and because she feels hunted, and because she feels vulnerable most of the time in her life, being in that shavasana, that flat on your back position, is a very vulnerable place to be. And I think for her to physically, willfully do that is entirely uncomfortable for her. And that's why it's just not the right way for her to exit her yoga and meditation. It's not a productive or meaningful way for her to finish her practice because it's so uncomfortable for her.
Why do you think that she relaxes? Do you think it's because of the pose that Amira puts her in, or because she has turned toward Matthew?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I think that curling inward and being in that more fetal position, that more protected position, certainly more childlike position, is more comfortable. And she is also facing Matthew. So I think it's probably a little bit of both for me. And can't really make a hypothesis about it because it doesn't happen again, really. So yeah, I think it's probably 50-50. What do you think?
I think reading it again, I think it might have to do a little bit of both, but mostly because she has turned towards Matthew and that she is no longer exposed and alone, sort of solitary. She's facing him, and because they are facing each other, it's no longer as stressful for her. They have that moment of connection that happens afterwards where apparently they just lie on the floor and gaze lovingly into one another's eyes.
Which is adorable.
It is adorable. It is adorable. It's one of those moments where you think this is a little bit like a romantic comedy where they're just like locked across the crowded ballroom, only it's a yoga mat and presumably everyone but Matthew is sweating.
Yeah. Super sweaty. A nice glow. A nice healthy glow. There's a little funk in that room.
Oh.
Some yoga funk. If you've ever done yoga or any like group exercise class, you will know what I mean.
Do we think that creatures have funk?
I know, I'm sorry. Do witches sweat? Like, I feel like witches could remedy the sweat stink though, if they had like powers, just like coloring your hair or doing something else like Hamish talks about. Like, I feel like being stinky is something that's very easily remedied. And the vampires don't sweat, so no. I don't know about the demons. I feel like they're the hippiest around of the group, so maybe they have a little aroma.
But did you notice that in this chapter on page 81 at the bottom, it's the first time that Diana expresses an understanding of what's important to a demon, that she's capable of seeing demons with a bit of perspective, having talked to Agatha.
Yeah.
Where she realizes that what they're drawn to is the idea of the energy, that demons are attracted to things that expose or expel a great deal of energy, and that they're always looking for something that is creative.
Energetic.
Mm-hmm.
Creative, energetic. Yeah. I do think that's really, really interesting. It could just be, yes, her conversation with Agatha, but also her like growing exposure to other creatures, I think. I have a question. Mm-hmm. Speaking of gazing lovingly and, all the stuff at the end of yoga, do you think, given just what we've talked about with Diana's magic up until this point, do you think Matthew can feel her quote-unquote touch on his face? Because she talks about drawing her finger, in her imagination, drawing her finger along his nose and imagining like all the places he's been and wondering how old he is. Do you think he can feel her doing that? Like, is she using magic again, or is that just her imagination? Oh. Given what we know up until this point, since we've basically decided she uses magic all the time.
I don't know.
I was wondering about that. I don't know either, but I'm like, I feel like it's a possibility.
Yeah, I think it is too.
That it's her mind's eye, that she's like literally like reaching out with her magic and just kind of like running her finger along, his face. And if he senses it in any way.
Wow. Maybe.
But doesn't let on because he's Matthew.
Yeah, I don't know, but I like that. I like thinking that. I like that read of it, that she's reaching out with magical fingers and sort of doing a, down his face, And that's...
And she doesn't know she's doing it, but we've decided already that she just does magic all the time, so...
And that's one of the things that starts that connection between them, is the fact that touch that she imagines is quite intimate. You know, I can't think of almost anybody whose face I would sort of trace like that other than Mr. Kate.
Right. Yeah. Be a little weird. I would not turn to just any rando in yoga class and do it, that's for
Not
sure.
even a cute one.
Not even a cute one.
In fact, I believe that's called assault.
Yes. I believe it is.
I do have a friend who, when she gets super festive, engages in a bit of face petting, but everybody knows it's coming.
Yeah, I can't do face petting at all. That happens exactly once in my life, and that person is lucky I did not punch them in the face. So.
Note to self, I will not ever trace your nose.
It was totally, no. It was completely like by surprise, because I literally met this person and they did what we called a pretty kitty, which is like when you pet a cat like you're like a 5-year-old, you know, like you do like pretty kitty, and you like just like exert undue amounts of force on a cat, but to my face, and we had literally just met, and I was like, dude, walk away.
So, getting past the part where Diana pretty kitties Matthew in her mind.
With her magic.
Her magical fingers.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, so she wonders
really
again how old he is. Thank you. I would love to know what the listeners think about this whole like moment between them. If you guys can weigh in, do you think he can feel it or not? Inquiring minds want to know.
Absolutely.
And we get the first hint of how old he is because he says he built this house, which means he is at least 500 years old, given the math on the house.
I absolutely love these 2 pages. I love them. I love them. I love them. Every time I look back at them, I'm a little bit more enamored of Matthew, and here's why. You get in this very deft conversation his attention to detail, the fact that he was powerful enough to have known Henry Tudor, that he was powerful enough to have been given land, that he cared enough or felt sympathetic enough for the stonemason who wanted to try to build the chimneys that he hated, but he let them do it anyway because it was apparently so important to this stonemason to give it a try. And Matthew,
that they try it?
Absolutely. And he's like, yeah, the chimneys were a mistake, but I didn't have the heart, right? And the same thing where he talks about how he didn't want to tear down the abbey because he loved the work of art so much that he didn't want to destroy it, but he couldn't get away with much of it. There's so much there. And Diana talks a little bit about him being quiet and still and all of these other things.
Solid and true.
And all of these things that are not as deep, I think, or as important as what's going on in the dialogue that he's telling her about the house that he built and how he chose to build it. And more importantly, the people that he interacted with when it was being built and what that says about him as an individual. So it
is delightful. Yeah.
Ka-thump.
Yeah. And I love too that he has enough, he is not, well, he is a little bit of an artist, but he's enough, she doesn't know that about him at this point, but he built the house. So he's enough of an artist to recognize something that needs to be saved, to recognize when something is worthy of saving and attention.
And to appreciate things for what they are, where they are, when they are. Like, he has this remarkable ability to love well-made, well-executed specific things. We talk about, the Jaguar or the Old Lodge or carpets, or like things that are well-made or well-executed are important to Matthew, and he collects them.
So then we go up and we have some tea at the gatehouse.
We are in England,
and
after all.
We're going to have tea just all the time. And I'm curious because I'm going to call this a character introduction because she is so present in all of the books. This is where we meet Louisa.
This is such beautiful work right here. Oh, it is so good. And we don't even see Louisa yet, but we know everything we need to know about Louisa in like 4 sentences. it's extraordinary.
And Louisa is someone who, I mean, it's not a spoiler. She's dead, obviously, because they talk about it in this chapter. They in
fact talk rather specifically about how she died.
Yes, they do. Yes,
pretty.
It's not pretty. She died tragically, and I am curious how I have feelings about her as a character, and I want to call her a character because she's so present in all of the books. You know, she is. The ghost of her is always present in interesting ways, and she keeps coming up. And she, to me, she's the first evidence we have that Matthew has family, even though she is deceased. But we get this indication that he has loved ones. He has a family who are vampires, which we haven't had before. We've had Miriam, but that's like the only other association we've really had with vampires with him. In that. The first indication that Matthew has also lost people in a tragic way. And I think for Diana, it's really important for her to know that about him, that he has, in some senses, the same history that she does in terms of, loss and grief and family.
Absolutely. It's also of note in the text that as we go, we are distinguishing more and more about individual members of species, that it's not just about all vampires are like X, all demons are like Y, all witches are like Z. Louisa and Matthew, even though they're from the same family, and he clearly regards her as someone who is very important to him, they're very, very different. And the way that he describes her, especially that part, the death was only as terrible as the woman who suffered it. I loved my sister, but she didn't make that easy. And he goes on to say that if there was excess to be found, Louisa found it. And in that nutshell, you get the Louisa that you will meet eventually. You get this creature who is as otherworldly and lethal as she is beautiful, but who is also a little bit unbalanced and not easy to control.
So anyway, I'm calling it her character introduction.
I think that's fair.
Even though we are not going to get real Louisa for quite some time. But she is important prior to her actual physical introduction. And so we have this conversation over tea, and it starts off, I guess we could call it pleasant, talking about your dead sister. But in a familiar way, we get some more discussion of species biases on both sides, and not necessarily discussion, but just kind of like dropped hints of each of their personal biases towards other species more.
We also get that comment that Matthew makes about going through the motions and how comforting it is for him. And to me, that spoke of his desire for community, ritual, connection. The desire that even though he has this family and he clearly has people around him, he does not feel like he is a part of things. And maybe he engages in like going to Mary's or going to the clinic or sometimes doing rounds to stay a part of the age that he is in. Anyways, so I think it's interesting that Matthew has this need for community and connection, and that maybe that's why he decides to participate in all of these things, is to stay connected to an age when I can imagine after 1,500 years there wouldn't be much of human nature that you haven't seen.
Yeah. The rituals change, but the people do not so much.
Absolutely.
And then we move into a space that makes Diana very uncomfortable, because we start talking about magic and we start talking about Diana's magic. And Matthew, to me, is trying to break through Diana's denial about magic, about how much she uses magic, about the place of magic in this world, about her place in the world. And so we enter into this very like serious discussion where Matthew is like, no, like, you need to listen to me. You use magic all the time. It's dangerous. You don't understand it. You don't understand what these people want from you. And she's just kind of like, no, cooties, like the whole time.
Again, to me, that just says trauma, right? That's just the trauma of feeling hunted and having lost her parents and feeling like magic is responsible for all of the bad things. Where when we really take this series apart and take Diana's psyche apart, as it turns out, like, the magic, just like everything else, isn't inherently good or bad. It's the people that use it that are the problem, or that, you know, it's not humans necessarily that are dangerous. It can be the uncontrolled emotions and prejudices of other people. So the idea of anything being fundamentally good or bad, I think, is something that the series wrestles with a little bit. But I do actually rather like the way that Matthew sets himself at a certain distance from Diana in this conversation and is allowed in the space of the text to give her a very necessary sort of check on her own emotions and say, look, Diana, I don't care how much you use magic, but I'm surprised how much you care.
And how much you lie about it. You know, how much you cover it up. And she is not ready to let go at this point. She becomes afraid, and she makes this comment about, you know, the reason other people fear vampires, but the reason that she doesn't like him is, you know, his detachment and blah, 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 blah. Forgetting the fact that she just made all these comments about him being like solid and true and like whatever, blah, blah, blah. You know, not 20 minutes ago. But it's not, to me, that is just her. She doesn't like that he is telling truths about her nature that she recognizes as true, but is not willing to accept. And so she turns it back around and is like, well, you're being cold and calculating, and you're a vampire, and I should not be near you. And, you know.
Yeah, because her fundamental vulnerability is a combination of fear and identity. Not only the fear of being discovered, which she mentions straight on in this chapter, but then doesn't really address very much, but also the fear of her own identity and the fear of becoming an identity. You know, part of it is the fear of the notoriety that her parents had, and the fear of who she actually is, the unity of her identity being so frightening that she can't confront it head on. And it's an interesting mirror, I think, for the two of them as characters, that they both have a certain amount of fear of their identity and who they are, what they're capable of, and who they could become. That over the course of this book and over the course of all three books, we get to have a conversation about redemption that I think starts in chapter 9. So I'm really excited to get to that.
Before we do, my one last note on chapter 8 is that, so Diana becomes afraid, you know, she gets really agitated, she gets afraid. Matthew recognizes that about her, either because of his preternatural senses or because he's just like being empathetic, and provides distance for her, but also distances himself. And I think part of the reason he becomes detached is because of what we will talk about in chapter 9, you know, his creature and his creature needs are now conflicting because she has become afraid and he can sense it. So he needs to detach himself in order to, one, keep her safe, and two, kind of like figure out and process, and three, she also needs the space. So it serves both of them.
Right. And Matthew's ethics are curious. They take a long time for you to sort of understand, but he most certainly has them, and he's most certainly putting them at play. And you can see shades of his age, his experience, his prior involvement with other creatures and helping other creatures learn to survive and exist in the world and be who they are, coming out here, where he says this thing about the fear and denial is not a way that is open to a witch, which I feel like it has so much weight behind it, as though he has seen other witches in particular try to deny who they are and seen it destroy them. Or perhaps he's speaking from his own experience, although I think that the very civilization of him is one of the things that is perhaps at least contrary in popular culture to the way we expect his nature to be.
Yeah, I'm just probably potentially him just speaking about nature in general. I would say human nature, but
nature and nurture are a big deal in this book.
Nature and nurture, yes, they are. So,
also civilization and barbarism and all sorts of other fun dichotomies.
So many themes.
Look, it's good to have a lot of themes. That's why we can keep talking.
That's true. So let's do. And so Matthew drops her off. She senses the distance. They say goodbye. Matthew drives to Scotland. Like, immediately.
Yes. Immediately to Scotland. And not that I blame him. Scotland is lovely.
In September, I feel we're bordering on the loveliness of Scotland in September.
Look, I'm still trying to work out why Matthew is super into wine but doesn't like whiskey.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe he's just had enough time and he knows what he likes.
This is true. He's allowed to love what he loves, as it were. I like this opening in chapter 9 of him sort of in flight from Diana. I think we get that later, that he's actually running from her in a sense.
Like fairly shortly into this chapter, actually.
Oh, for sure. But the one thing I wanted to sort of tease out was where he talks about driving up to Hamish's place and the odd remnant of a grand life that no one wanted to live anymore. And I thought that was such a beautiful moment to have, because the idea of artifact and time passing, that this is like a remnant of another age that is still here, and it's a remnant of an age that Matthew lived through and that Matthew probably knew, and the idea that perhaps maybe one of the reasons he doesn't like Hamish's Lodge is because he knew the original owner.
Right.
Who knows?
Like, he knew there used to be a castle there, so...
Exactly.
He's probably been there.
Right. And talking about a life that no one wants to live anymore, and the immense sadness of that. That's another, like, aspect of Matthew that we get in these 3 chapters, is how sad and solitary and lonesome this life must be, to be so old and to have seen so much.
Right. And he is himself an artifact. We know now. He's at least 500 years old. That makes you an artifact.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's not like a troglodyte or anything on the bottom of the ocean, but he's...
A nautilus. He is not...
A mathilus.
Anywho, this is not our archaeology show. Moving
Do we have an archaeology show?
No, we do not. That's probably a good thing.
Fact.
So before we get into Hamish, I just want to like ruminate a little bit on his mood as he gets to the lodge and he gets to he's fleeing. He's driving through and it's very early in the morning. It's still dark. He gets to Hamish's lodge and he has the kind of like the coarseness of the descriptions. He talks about the witch's scent and he needs to get it out of his nose, and he's very kind of like clipped and irritated, and he gets there and Hamish is like, dude.
For sure. But I think that goes back to the conversation we were just having about the struggle between what Matthew in this chapter sort of recognizes as his instincts and his ethics, where he's purposefully placing distance and calling her the witch.
The witch. He doesn't even use her name until almost the end of this chapter.
No, and
it's just the witch.
And then it's a surrender when he gives that fact to Hamish, and he sort of lets the implication of Diana sort of settle with him. Let's be clear. When Hamish brings up mating for the first time, I think Matthew knows what's happening. I absolutely think that he's too flipping old. And he's known...
And smart.
And he knows too many other vampires. And so maybe he's doing the Diana denial thing, like they've been around each other, they've held hands, and so some of her denial has rubbed
there was
off
a
on
squeeze.
Him. She squeezed some of her denial onto him. But...
That's also kind of gross. No. This is essence of denial.
So I think that Matthew has at least an inkling of what's happening, and his distancing is in part an effort to hit the brakes on that, because
he would really like for it not to be true.
I think he would like it not to be true, but as we see later in the chapter, it's because he knows all of the implications of that. And he is terrified of what that means for him, because he's also very sure what some of his feelings about Diana are. But we should maybe talk about Hamish, and then we can come back to more of Matthew.
Yes. We'll leave the heavy things and we'll move to Hamish, the best friend, and Sweet William and Whiskey. And yes, how do we like Hamish?
I love Hamish. I really love Hamish.
Hamish can also be my best friend.
Absolutely, Hamish can be best friends. And I'd like to contrast the introduction of Hamish's boyfriend, Sweet William, with the paragraph that
Sarah
we get
and M.
about Sarah and M, because this is, like, as an example,
is the right way to do this kind of thing.
Exactly. So you just breeze by it and you say, you know, with that tiny bit of exposition, this is my boyfriend. I compare him to a flower. Now he bothers florists for flowers, and it's adorable.
Isn't it adorable?
And then you move on.
Right. That is the more accomplished and more thoughtful and more satisfying method of handling that particular character introduction.
More secure. Like, there are certainly places as this book goes on where you can feel Deborah Harkness becoming more secure in the voice that she's using and the story that she's telling. Whereas I think that those first couple chapters are just a little bit bumpy because they're insecure and because there's a lot of exposition that has to happen very, very quickly. What do you think of this first sort of interaction between Hamish and Matthew, where Hamish says that, like, very cheeky, do you have time for a drink first?
I feel like Hamish is definitely somebody who can BS with Matthew and get away with it. Like, it's clear that they've known each other for a long time. You don't even need that note about how they've known each other for 20 years. Like, you understand that this is somebody that Matthew trusts, that he called him in the middle of the night. Clearly Hamish is willing to be like, okay, I'll be there, you know, like, this is clearly best friend territory. And Hamish is perfectly willing to call Matthew on his BS and also give Matthew a little pushback, sometimes much needed pushback. So I enjoy it. I enjoy his sass.
I enjoy his sass. I also enjoy the things that they have in common. You know, their love of and fascination with humans, and the very clear regard and affection that they share for one another. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but another one of the character details that makes me just sort of like fall over for Matthew a little bit is when they talk about Hamish's birthday present, about showing him the MRI of his brain.
It's so sweet.
The good bottle of champagne, and the amount of thoughtfulness and attention that it would take to come up with that kind of a present and to say, no, I'm going to give you something that will not only help you understand who you are, but also show you that you're special to me.
And it is also going to thrill you to bits.
It's really... it thrill you to bits, like made specifically to delight you.
And what was it I was going to say? I think it's really interesting because we also get to contrast their tastes a little bit. They have all of these things in common. They're both very intelligent. They enjoy conversation. You know, they're equals in intellect. But they also, you know, you have this contrast where we have had Matthew's very, like, I don't want to say masculine, but I'm just going to because it's the only word I can think. Masculine, you know, leather and dark wood and, you know, like all of these things. And then we have Hamish, who is like, he enjoys the little like cherubs and, you know, flowers, and not because he is a gay demon, but I think mostly because they irritate Matthew. And so he keeps them around because he knows Matthew doesn't like them.
I think that Hamish also enjoys, like, he's fundamentally a bit playful, and he likes some of the irony of it, that you have, say, this big
hunting
like
lodge.
masculine hunting lodge that has this weirdo dining room full of gilded arches and putty. Yeah. You know, like, he thinks that's hilarious.
Yeah. And I enjoy that about him very, very much. And also, you know, he prefers whiskey. He is Scottish. Matthew prefers wine. They know this about each other. They have their drinks of choice. And no, you're right. I don't know why Matthew doesn't like whiskey, but really adores wine. But that's fine.
It's all right. I also love the little tiny detail we get about Hamish, where his butler sometimes has to serve peanut butter and banana sandwiches for breakfast. That Hamish just has, like, a little bit of whimsy. Like, he may be consulted by prime ministers, but he just sometimes, like, he's the kind of dude that would eat a peanut butter banana sandwich in his striped pajamas type dude. I like Hamish. I like Hamish a lot.
What do we think of Hamish as kind of like redemption for demons? A little bit. for demons as a species. Do you feel like it redeems demons at all, or do you think that it's pointed out so much that Hamish is outside of demons that it doesn't really compensate for all of the poo-pooing, psychos, serial killers, and artists that we've gotten so far about demons?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a matter of redemption for demons so much as it is. I do think it's curious that it's pointed out how different Hamish is from other demons, and therefore that's one of the reasons that Matthew likes him. So I do think that that's something that needs to be teased and worked out a little bit. But I do think that Hamish is one of the first fully realized people outside of Matthew and Diana that we get. We do have Em and Sarah, but even in those first couple paragraphs or those first couple chapters,
we haven't had much, though.
We haven't. And Hamish is the first one who really bursts onto the scene in full light and color and puts Matthew and Diana in perspective. And so I don't know that it's so much about his redemption of or transformation of the way that demons are described as it is about him personally being just a delight. What about for you?
I think it works really well. I think it does a little bit to kind of dispel the whole flaky artist part of demons. Like, well, he's a financier, he's very powerful, he consults with people all over the world. He's he came from humble beginnings, and yet he's like a very successful demon person. I was gonna say person, but so I think it is very interesting, and you are definitely right that he's the third most drawn character, third most best drawn. English is hard. So anyway, they have wine and whiskey.
They do have wine, and Matthew sort of slowly, deliberately, and begrudgingly gives Hamish bits and pieces of the story. And the way that the chapter is structured, it's very clear that Hamish is playing Matthew to a certain extent. Hamish knows how to get things out of Matthew, and he seems to understand intuitively that if Matthew came this far, that he wants to tell Hamish, and it's just a matter of actually getting it all
hitting
out.
All the right pressure points and massaging all of the right bits, and eventually it will, because we start off and it's just like a cursory what's the problem, it's a witch, and is she special? And Matthew's like, yeah. She is. But that's really all, and we get kind of the unemotional side. We get the facts of Diana first, which is that her mother's side are bishops, her father is a proctor. Hamish is like, dude, those are really powerful witches. And it is now clear to us that the bishops and proctors are well known throughout the creature world, not just among witches. That Diana's parents, at least her mother, are very distinguished, and that her lineage is very, very important.
Oh, absolutely. And we get a hint of why Matthew was so surprised that Diana doesn't use her magic, because Hamish is also surprised. So it's clear that in the world of creatures, Diana is an anomaly, not just because of the amount of power she potentially carries, but the fact that everyone would expect her to be using it, and she claims that she is not.
Right. And we kind of briefly touch on at the beginning the ways in which Diana lies to herself and as well to others, because Matthew states she says that she doesn't use magic, and then we kind of go off on a different tangent and don't address that directly right away. But we do get the indication that magic smells like something. And in fact, we get a lot of smells in this chapter. We know now what tons of things smell like.
And I think we're back in that same POV that we were in when we were in watching Matthew watch Diana sleep. So we've come back out of Diana's POV, and we're now somewhere, not quite an omniscient narrator, but it's more like we're a fly on the wall for Hamish and Matthew. So we're in the third person, but we're not really close to either of them. We're sort of sitting in between. And again, that narrative voice doesn't seem to have any of Diana's knowledge. So it does appear to be a separate narrative voice that is outside of both Matthew and Diana. and just observing, but I don't know. I don't have the narrative term for that. I'm sure there is one, but I do not have it.
I think I disagree with you. But I don't know if I can disagree with you yet. I think I'll have to wait till the end of the book.
Okay.
To discuss the narrative perspective, because I think it is still Diana, but
okay,
I think we'll have to wait.
We'll stick a pin in that.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Okay. We'll stick a pin still in the narrator.
Who is this narrator? Who is telling the story?
Let's see. So, yeah, we got lots of scent descriptions. We talk about her witch's shimmer that apparently most modern witches don't have anymore. Most. Usually he's like, I haven't seen it in a while. Modern witches don't really have it. Diana's got it.
Which is the first clue as to why he was transfixed in her room.
Right. Because we did talk about in the chapter that she has like kind of magic pouring out of her when she sleeps. And he's kind of like staring at it like, I haven't seen this in decades, kind of thing. Now we understand. And then they go stalking. And would you like to talk about stalking?
I would. I would like to talk about the fact that we take this moment to talk about how Matthew normally doesn't let a warm blood come with him hunting, but Hamish is an exception. But he wants to be by himself, specifically while he gets his craving for Diana under control. And it's a very pointed and specific reference to not only his hunger, but trying to control his hunger, trying to mediate it, trying to think through it, exercise his ethics, and to basically find a way to do what Diana does, right? Exercise the anxiety, get the emotion, get the energy out so that you can then begin to process what that actually means.
But Hamish goes with him, and I think that is just a privilege Hamish has, that he can say, nope, actually I'm going to come. Too bad. And Matthew's like, all right, get in. Yeah. Which, I mean, he's been stalking with Matthew before. This is clearly not the first time that they have been to the lodge together, have, been through this scenario. Not with a lady, but Hamish understands enough about Matthew to know that it's okay for him to come along.
What do you make of the fact that I can't remember, because I've now read this book so many times. I know that in this scene, Matthew doesn't kill a deer. When you were first reading it, do you remember whether you expected him to?
I think it was a little... My impression was that them going up there, he may or may not, when I first read it. I was like, he might, go hunting. That was kind of the reason he came here. But at the same time, I was like, it feels that Hamish is doing something very intentional, so he in fact may not, because we haven't seen or heard all of the things that we need to see in here. We haven't excised all of the things that we need to in this chapter before we can kind of like have that release at the end, so to speak, I guess. Was my impression of it.
Yes.
So I was 50-50.
I am having thoughts about a potential hunting 3-beat in this book. And I think this is the first beat. And maybe we'll talk about it later and when it gets subverted and how it gets subverted.
Okay.
Put a pin in the deer. Poor deer. So sorry, dear.
Yes. Pin. Put a pin. Mm-hmm. Chapter 9. Yeah, so he doesn't kill the deer. They stay out there for hours. And Matthew kind of has a chance to settle down, at least a little bit. Not entirely, but enough to kind of like focus his energy and come to a calmer place, a more focused place, before they go back in for dinner and billiards. Or billiards and dinner.
It's fascinating to me how much of their relationship is based around patience and strategy.
Do you think that says something about their personalities and their natures, or just about their relationship with each other and the way their relationship works?
A little bit of both. I can imagine that perhaps when they first met, they were probably a bit competitive, and that one of the things that they clearly enjoy is matching wits. And so what would interest two people who like to match wits more than games of strategy and skill in which you have to sort of constantly outthink and outdo and outmaneuver? So I think that that's a commonality that they share, but I think it's curious that their relationship has unspooled, shall we say, over the course of many, many hours. Clearly many, 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 many hours of doing precisely these sorts of things, of just being and existing together.
So I guess I would call billiards the next phase in Hamish's plan. Phase 2?
Phase
or
2.
2.5?
Phase 3 is obviously profit.
Clearly profit. We don't know what the profit's going to be. So yeah, we move into the next phase. They go down and they play billiards. We get this very nice discussion of more light on their relationship, about how Hamish always wins at snooker. Is it snooker that he always wins at? And Matthew always wins at the other game, and the
Carambole.
Yes, thank you, the French one. And so the middle ground is billiards.
Is the French going to be my job?
Yeah, it super is.
Sibian.
Yeah, I feel like, if we do some Latin and Greek, I got you there, but that won't be till book 2, so Spanish. It would be less offensive to everyone if you do the French.
Fair enough.
Anyway, I was going to try and explain the game of billiards to everybody, but I frankly do not understand the game of billiards. I have tried. I don't get it. There's cannons and stuff, and cues and balls, and that's all I got.
Yeah, that's all I got. I don't think that billiards is the most interesting thing that's going on here.
I think it's terribly important.
I think we can let it go.
Yeah, it's fine.
So during this phase 2 of Plan Hamish, he gets more and more information from Matthew and sort of starts pushing and pressing. And he finds out that Matthew has taken Diana to the Old Lodge, that Diana has met Amira, that Diana has gotten more of Hamish's Matthew than pretty much anybody before.
Any of the other ladies. Or perhaps, gentlemen.
Matthew's
friends,
women, as Hamish says.
Yes. None of Matthew's other women have gone to the Old Lodge. By the way, every time I read this, I wish Old Lodge was spelled with an E at the end of old, because I feel that would be appropriate to the time in which the Old Lodge was built. Ye Oldie Lodge.
I'm surprised that you didn't say Ye Oldie Lodgy. There's an E there, too.
Yes, true.
Anyways, I digress. We're at Cadzo now, so...
We do digress, yes. And we also, while they're playing billiards, get Matthew's account of their first meeting. Because we've had Diana's viewpoint, and now we get Matthew's view, or Matthew's story about their first meeting.
Yes, and we get the bit where Matthew says how he heard about Diana in the first place, and that it was really his curiosity and the manuscript that drew her in the first place, and then he stays for her, although he engages in a little bit of denial as well when he says, I'm not interested in her or Hamish, I'm interested in the manuscript. I've wanted the manuscript.
Well, this is only phase 2.
So. Only phase 2. Be patient, young grasshopper.
Yeah, and I think it is very interesting to get that perspective, because the way we have it told from Diana, and we've already discussed how Diana's kind of unreliable, and because of her vulnerability and her fear and her feeling that people are always out to get her, the story that we get of them meeting is much more sinister than it turns out it could potentially be.
Yes, and I think that that's a thread we might need to unpick a little bit, because Matthew's motivations, he doesn't expect to be interested in her at all, or to care at all, or to be in some ways charmed by her. But he is, and he keeps insisting that he's interested in the manuscript because he wants it, because, the affairs of witches are not important to vampires. But whatever it is, he's hooked.
Blah, blah, blah. Essence of denial. Squeezed into Matthew's life again. And then, we get the discussion of Ashmole 782, and we understand now that Matthew has been searching for it for at least 100 years. And we get the first indication of what he thinks is in there, and the creature stories from all of the 3 branches of creatures surrounding what could potentially be in the book. And Matthew and Hamish brings up the Philosopher's Stone, the alchemical idea of the Philosopher's Stone, which is eternal life, essentially. And Matthew's like, yeah, dude, that's totally what it is. And Hamish is like, oh, I didn't actually think that's what we thought that was. So I think it's interesting to finally get Matthew's perspective of what he thinks the book could be and why it's important to him.
Mm-hmm. And to get at least some of his frustration, not only with his obsession, his growing obsession with Diana, but also with the ease with which she was able to acquire the thing that he'd been looking for 100 years or more.
And it's kind of adorably frustrating because he's talking about how, like, he's been searching for it for hundreds of years, and then this witch comes along who doesn't even, like, says she doesn't use any magic, and she breaks the spell, and she has absolutely no interest in keeping the book, and she sends it back, and he's, like, clearly so peeved at her because he's like, I don't understand how this possibly could have happened.
And then quickly, so quickly, he shifts into this place where Hamish recognizes that Diana's not just a fascination, she is becoming a vulnerability for Matthew in a way that it seems like Hamish has not known Matthew to be vulnerable before, where all of a sudden Hamish says, did you get in between her and her own people? Did you cross a line that apparently Hamish hasn't ever seen Matthew cross when it comes to other creatures?
Or is just not done in polite creature society.
Right. Have you broken this taboo for her? And Matthew essentially crumples and admits that he did and that it was instinctive. Because when we go back to that first chapter where he moves to protect her, where he engages in the mantling behavior, which is what it's called in Falcons, by the way, that seems to be completely instinctive. It happens in a split second. He just does it. And all of a sudden, almost without his control or without his conscious commitment to the idea, he has placed himself at odds with everything that she is supposed to be.
Yeah. And then we get into this discussion where it's the gray areas of cravings and mating, and we have the very purposeful use of the word desire in there in discussion of, you know, the difference between cravings and mating, and both come from desire, and Matthew coming to terms with the fact that this is true. and Hamish pointing out the fact that, like, dude, you're hunting her.
And Matthew's woundedness and vulnerability in that moment is probably what finally thoroughly redeems his crawling in the window behavior for me, because he says it out loud, right? And he actually acknowledges the thing that he has done that would otherwise, in my mind, be so objectionable. He comes out and says, hey, best friend, I did this thing, and it's not a good thing, and it's a thing that I'm not proud of. It's a thing where I followed my instincts, and I became fascinated, and I may have given in to that, but I'm not going to give in to the rest. And that is perhaps, again, what closes the loop for me on that bit that we didn't like earlier, and why I perhaps forgive him for it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then we move into phase 3. Dinner.
Right. Attack.
So we have this dinner. We get some more information on vampires, just vampires' dietary habits, since we're getting none of that from Diana because she clearly knows nothing about it. And a nice discussion of, like, what they do actually eat and some of their dietary habits. And we have this lovely dinner. Matthew accidentally, on purpose, insults Hamish with his species biases, and we get Hamish's history and his, quite frankly, exceptionalism in the creature world comes out in some reminiscences over dinner.
And Hamish's ability to call BS on Matthew, which is something that in the course of these books, very few people are able to do successfully or as effectively, as swiftly, as thoroughly as Hamish can. Hamish simply says, oh, so you're the only two kinds of creatures that matter. Right? Like, you have decided that you as a vampire and a witch can't be together, but, you know, if demons get involved, that's just so much stuff and nonsense because we don't really contribute.
Which I think is great, and Hamish is right to have done that, and Matthew's like, yeah, sorry about that.
But Hamish also does this thing where he places himself at sort of a crossroads between these three species, where he talks about how difficult it is to accept being a demon or a witch, where you are human enough that you can not necessarily be mistaken for anything else. You can move amongst humans, but you're definitely not like them. You have different powers and abilities and needs from humans, whereas he sees being a vampire as being incontrovertible. Once it happens, that is what you are, and you are, and you learn to exist with that sort of like fatalism, essentially, that there's nothing that will ever keep you from being a vampire.
There is an interesting note where Hamish says, so you like this witch even though you don't like lies. And I'm curious what you think about that, because I feel like it's a little out of place, and I don't know that we have really had all that much evidence that that is true. We have evidence that Matthew has tons of secrets, but him not liking lies, I'm not sure about that assessment. And I'm wondering what you think.
I'm not sure about it either, other than to say that I think that Matthew certainly has a certain amount of contempt for people evading him. Like, he has a lot of secrets, but he always likes to be the one who knows the most in the room. He likes to be the most self-possessed and the most capable. And again, I think it's in a touch of commonality between himself and Diana, that they both have this relationship with the truth. And I think that Matthew has a miserly approach to the truth, where he doesn't want to give little pieces of himself to other people, but he also probably doesn't like it when people try to offer him things that are not true. That makes sense?
Yes.
It might not have made sense.
No, it made sense. It was very smart. I understood. It was. You stop that. And we get Hamish, bless him, is the first person in this book to come out and say, when Matthew's talking about how Diana's life is a lie, and he's the first person to say, wouldn't it be interesting to know why she is living this lie? Why is it that she is lying to herself, and why is it that she protects herself so much? And he's the first person in this book to do that. And I'm like, thank you. Wouldn't it be interesting if Matthew wanted to know that?
Absolutely. And if Matthew were less engaged with the current issue of, what he wants from Diana, and the whys that he prides himself on asking, like a good scientist.
Feels like a pretty big one.
But at the same time, some of that is maybe instinctual. Like, maybe Matthew can't get there because his energy and his resources and his intellect at this point are devoted to the hunt. They're not devoted to understanding really who Diana is. They're interested in the puzzle of Diana. The puzzle of Diana and how Diana currently works, as opposed to why she started working that way in the first place.
And then Hamish also notes that because she's clearly living in this very tangled web of her own denial and everything, that the only way for Matthew to get through to her is through trust. Diana has to trust him for anything to happen.
Do you think Hamish would say that if he did not suspect that Matthew was mating?
No.
Tell me why.
Because that feels like something that feels like best friend Hamish trying to help Matthew get the girl, get his, future wife, to help him, to help him out as a bro. More than it feels like Hamish trying to further Matthew's academic pursuits. To me.
I sort of saw it as trying to assist Matthew in his own process of self-reflection and in understanding what it will take in order for Matthew to basically make a life with this other creature. That in order for Matthew to do the thing that Matthew's instincts are telling him to do, he is going to have to do something that is personally very difficult for him to do, and that is to share, to be open, to be honest, to be trusting. And if this is the relationship that Matthew really wants, he's going to have to change the way that he sees himself vis-a-vis those that are close to him.
And then the end of phase 3 takes a little bit of a turn into vampire murders again. We should definitely stick a pin in that. I know it's come up a couple of times. That is a slow burn on that one. And I actually forgot how soon it came up in the story.
It is a very, very slow burn, but it's a burn.
That's a 3-book burn.
That's a 3-book burn with like lots of crunchy bits that we probably can't talk about until we get to the end of the burn.
Really at all. Except to say, let's put a pin in it.
Right. We get a little bit of it in a couple chapters when they go to the lab, I think, and we can talk about some of that. But, you know, moving out of the murders, and then we get into
Phase 4.
Phase 4, which is
chess
and part of Matthew's secrets and his vulnerability, and the fact that Matthew, although he has this veneer of civilization, he considers himself to be a monster.
Before we get to the monster part, they have a very lovely discussion about what Matthew wants and what he doesn't want. And
oh, did I skip that?
I don't remember if it's before or after the other part. So we could just talk about it now, or we could talk about the other part.
Let's talk about the really important part. The super, super important part.
Which is the wants and doesn't want? Or the
yes,
Cecilia
I think it's the
and
wants
Eleanor?
And doesn't want.
Okay. So we have Hamish saying, you know, what is it that you want? And Matthew saying, I don't know. And Hamish is like, well, do you know what you don't want? And Matthew is basically like, yeah, I don't want to do, you know, X, Y, and Z. And Hamish is like, okay, well, what you're left with then is love. So congratulations, you do know what you want. You just have a really roundabout way of saying it.
Right, but the X, Y, and Z are so fundamental and important to Matthew and Diana's relationship that we can't really gloss over them.
We cannot. Do you have them, the specific quote? Because I don't have it in front of me. That's
yes, it's 3 things. So, and I have like a weird Into the Woods moment. 1, the cow is white as milk. 2, the cape is red as blood. 3. Anyways, so
it's
3.
Fair.
3 things.
I didn't want to flub it. Go on.
The first is, I will not give in to this craving for her blood. The second is, I do not want to control her power. And third, I certainly have no wish to make her a vampire. So there's so much crunch in those 3 things that I think tells us everything we need to know about Matthew's potential for his relationship with Diana, which is that he absolutely does not want to hurt her, drain her, destroy her, undermine her, dominate her, change her. And that's no small thing, because he has the capacity to do all of them. And we get the hint in this chapter that when he was a younger vampire, he might have tried to do any one or all of those things.
I cannot say it better than that. So I feel like from Diana's perspective, she has a fear of people doing just those very things. And the fact that he comes out directly, you know, basically without prompting. I mean, he's not talking to her, he's talking to Hamish, and he's like, I do not want to do those things that she is afraid of, even though I don't know that she's afraid of those things.
Yes. And in the sort of narrative structure of romantic novels, they talk about how one of the things you're supposed to do in the first act, and I believe we're still very, very much in the first act of this story, not just the first act of this book, but the first act of all the books.
Story.
The story period. One of the things that you're supposed to do is show the essential rightness of the 2 romantic characters for one another, and to do so in a way that shows that if they could only get their stuff together, they would be really capable and competent and complementary. And this is one of the places where there's like a bell ringing somewhere, where it's like, these are all the things that Diana doesn't know how to articulate, that she doesn't want someone to do to her, but he has instinctively, without prompting, without them ever having a conversation about it, said, these are my boundaries that I am putting on my very strong feelings for her that are even a little bit out of my control, but to the extent that I can control myself and that I can learn to control how I feel, these are my red lines that I will not cross. Because each one of them would undermine who she is and why he wants her.
All he wants to do is love her. We come to find out. Thank you, Hamish, for solving that problem. Yes. And then we get a little goth and we get a bit of sad, tragic Matthew, because we get into this discussion with Hamish is like, well, why are you afraid of killing her? Like, you've never killed another mortal, and the wine glass snaps and Matthew's like, actually...
There was that time.
Those 2 times, come to find out. Well, one, but
I think
Matthew's guilt is something we're gonna have to talk about.
Matthew's guilt and his redemptive arc and his own self-loathing are a thing that I think we have to grapple with for the entirety of the series. But this is the first place where I think that you both get it full on from him, and then you also get Hamish being like, no. One of those things is different than the other. One of those is definitely something to be frightened of. The other one has to do with a different kind of immaturity than what we were talking about. And that is the difference between Eleanor and Cecilia. Where Eleanor, definitely, be afraid of that. That is terrible. That is horrible. You should be ashamed. And you should try to redeem yourself. But with
Cecilia was a poor younger choice.
And still... unforgivable in a lot of ways, but at least in terms of Cecilia's demise, I understand how he can carry the responsibility of it and be responsible for it, and also say, no, she chose that particular end for herself, and maybe she wouldn't have done so but for the fact that you were there, you were a contributing cause. But that is absolutely different than what happened with Eleanor.
Right. So, to summarize, Eleanor, we come to find out, was a woman that Matthew was in love with a long, long time ago. We don't have a specific time frame. He and his brother, his unnamed brother, but it was Baldwin. Matthew's brother, Baldwin. Not a fan. Are having an argument. And Eleanor gets in between them, and in blind rage, she is dead. And we don't really fully understand what happens yet. We just know that Eleanor died rather gruesomely and tragically in that argument. Contrasted with Cecilia, who Matthew was infatuated with because everyone was in love with someone else's wife at the time in history, and he wanted... France.
Same place, same famille.
And he becomes infatuated and he wants to taste her.
Sur le ciel de Paris.
Oui.
Otherwise known as that time that Matthew spent too much time at the opera.
Yeah. He decides he wants to taste her. He, follows her home.
Oh, by the way,
her, yes.
Per a much earlier conversation we once had about ballet and the ballet Onegin, I sort of imagine Matthew in the Tatiana and...
well, there's an opera Onegin as well.
Right, but I see them in that sort of like time period with the Parisian fashions and the spinning around. So I imagine that his relationship with Cecilia is basically all of the ballet Onegin. Headcanon.
Well, that's very lovely and tragic. As is Onegin. Anyway, he decides he has to taste her, charms her, follows her home, whatever... drinks her blood, cannot control himself and cannot stop, becomes afraid and turns her into a vampire without her consent, which we find out is one of Matthew's ethics rules. And it's a good ethic. Consent is important, including when siring someone as a vampire.
It's a good ethic. We like that ethic. And super, super interesting because later on... even though he has explicit consent for some things, he's like, yeah, no, not yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a good idea yet. We can talk about that when we get there.
Patronizing.
Yeah. So, it turns her into a vampire. She hates it. Turns out she didn't agree to this. She hates it. She decides... Yeah, weird. She ends her life by walking into a fire, and Matthew, of course, harbors all the guilt for that as well. That is Eleanor and Cecilia.
And this is where we get Matthew basically and his self-loathing and feeling himself to be a monster, to be irredeemable, to feel that no matter what else he has done in an extraordinarily long life, where there have presumably been hundreds of creatures, humans, that he's interacted with, these two matter. And these two matter because they hurt him, because they surprised him, because he's ashamed of them. And he is afraid that those two incidents are about who he really is, and that everything else is just window dressing. Lipstick on the proverbial pig.
Right. Oink.
On a bat?
No, pig's fine. It works.
Okay.
Sow.
But we get this glimpse of Matthew trying to wrestle with his own monstrosity and with his own dangerousness.
Yeah, and fortunately Hamish is there, like you said, to put a little perspective into the situation when Matthew's like, I have all the guilt for all of it. All the blame is mine. I am terrible. It's all me. I am at fault. Nobody else had anything to do with any of it. And Hamish is like, on the one hand, So, and I appreciate that about Hamish, and I think that's important for Matthew to be, because Matthew does tend to wallow sometimes, and it's important for him to have someone who is like, no. No wallowing.
Well, and for Hamish to just love him through it and say, okay, this horrible, terrible, no good, very bad thing happened. And that is a monstrous thing you did, but that does not make you a monster.
And of course, the lovely line about, Matthew's just like, oh, I'll just leave now. And Hamish is like, no.
Oh, but so, you know what that is to me? That's family, right? That's what family is when you find that somebody that you love has done something really horrible, or maybe you're not proud of them, or maybe they've disappointed you, or they've hurt somebody, but they still stay under your roof and you take care of them because you love them, and those are your people. And it goes to one of the larger themes, I think, of the series in general about what makes a family, what constitutes a family, what brings people together. And I think that the recognition of the light and dark in the people you love is one of the things that strengthens a family and makes it durable over the course of time and tragedy. And Hamish's ability to say, I cannot absolve you, but I can forgive you, is a really extraordinary thing, and it's why Hamish is so special.
Right. And two, I mean, we would be in an entirely different story if Matthew told those stories and did not have guilt about it. And Matthew's guilt, while he is overdoing it on the guilt, his ability to have guilt and to recognize his wrongs is very important to his character. And I think one of the reasons that Hamish is able to say, you know what, it's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but we're brothers and it's fine. And I think without that guilt, well, he wouldn't be Matthew, so.
Well, he put it on the table. He offered it and said, here is the darkest, ugliest part of me that I can find right now. And here is the thing that is holding me back. And I'm presenting it to you so that you will help me understand. And what Matthew believes that he needs to do at this point is for Hamish to help him break off the thing with Diana. I think that that's part of the reason he goes to Scotland, to get the scent of witch out of his nose, is for Hamish to talk sense into him and say, no, you are a monster. Like, you absolutely should not go near her again. And while Hamish does sort of caution him about what it might be like, Hamish is also in a position to say, you are not, all is not lost. You are not lost.
How do you feel about just moving off into the very end of the chapter, how do you feel about the protecting the queen metaphor? Because I feel like it's kind of a 3-beat in this book that we can talk about more. But how do you feel about that?
Do you think in the book or in the series?
Definitely in the book. I'll have to finish reading the rest of the series to discuss if I think. I know it's a theme and a metaphor in the series, but the 3-beat I think is just in this book. But I wonder how it works for you, if it's a little too on the nose or if it extends out very well for you.
I think it extends out pretty decently for me because it says so much about Matthew's need to keep his people safe, but specifically his need to eventually keep Diana safe, and the tension between needing to keep her safe and allowing her to be who she is and to be as powerful as she is, to be as capable, also requires a great deal of flexibility that he doesn't have yet. And he's not, for all of his years, for all of his education, he's not mature enough yet emotionally to allow her to be everything she's capable of being. And I think that that conflict is really nicely encapsulated, because I think he realizes that that's part of the case and part of what is holding him back from mating, as we find out much, much later. And I don't feel like this is too much of a spoiler to say that he realizes that this is irrevocable. If he does this, these instincts are only going to be worse, and it runs the risk of him not being able to maintain his boundaries and not being able to protect her either from other people or from himself. And so I think it actually works very well for me to have him sitting there holding this piece, contemplating a representation of everything that he will have to give up, but everything that's also at risk for her if he chooses to play with that piece.
Mm-hmm. And I think it brings the chapter to a really lovely conclusion. You know, we have the metaphor of the queen in the chess piece, and clearly tying it to Diana. You know, Diana is the queen. And then this lovely, very, like, brief, but well-rounded, it rounds out the chapter well, discussion of Diana's worth and whether or not she is worth all of this. And he says that she absolutely is, you know.
Without hesitation.
Yeah, she's worth everything. End chapter.
Right. And to say those two things in the same chapter, to say that she's worth everything, but that there are also things that, because she is worth all of that, he will not cross these boundaries that Hamish is suggesting that his instincts are telling him to cross, and that he's suggesting that there are all these things that he wants to do and that his nature essentially is telling him to do, that he's saying, I'm not going to, because to do so would be to violate who she is, and she's worth the conflict that creates for me, is a super cool thing. And we'll stick a pin in a discussion about how well this gels for you vis-a-vis other vampire tropes about the desire for blood and the mixture of love, lust, sensuality, possession, etc. But I think that's a conversation for another night.
Yes, in a latter portion of this book, perhaps.
Faux show.
Gosh, we were so smart. We were so
smart. We were real smart for a real long time.
And it's over now. We kept it together for 2 hours.
And it's over. All right, so thank you for joining us for this episode. In our next episode, we will cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. We look forward to hearing your feedback. You can follow us on Twitter at Chamomile N, as in November Clove. You can email us at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com, or you can check out our website on WordPress,
which is chamomileandclovecast.wordpress.com. You can find us individually on Twitter. I am at Lean and Mean on Twitter.
And I am at Calintriel, CAITLINTRIALL. You can find both of those addresses in the profile of our Twitter page. So if you go there, you can find both of us and follow us on Twitter if you so desire.
And you can tag any conversation on Twitter with the hashtag CCAlchemy so that we can be sure to see it and read it and discuss it. And until next time, we look forward to reading about you guys.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Bye.